Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first ever episode of Disassembly Required. I'm your host, Jolene, and today we're going to be talking about a whole slew of topics, from current events to movies, all that other wonderful stuff you guys love. If you like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're going to be having a lot more coming your way. But first, let's talk about movies. Now, of course, it's October, season of Halloween, all the time for that spooky dooky stuff everybody loves. But, not just spooky stuff is out in theaters right now. We got big name movies. For instance, Joker. A lot of people are talking about the Joker. Personally, I've seen the movie. I like it a lot, actually. There's lots of different aspects of really great cinematography, really just fantastic acting on Joaquin Phoenix's part. And there's just a lot of really, really just heavy symbolism, a lot of different kind of stuff. But it's not the greatest movie in the world, It's directed by the same guy who made the Hangover movies, so don't set your hopes too high. It's not a masterpiece or anything, but it's definitely a good movie. I definitely recommend watching it if you're interested in just the character study, because there's so little reference to anything having to do with Batman or really just anything DC, aside from the fact that the main character is supposed to be the Joker. You can just really watch this without having any real interest in the DC universe, and I feel you can still get the same amount of enjoyment out of it. Being able to watch all of these really just interesting scenes, and Joaquin Phoenix as a whole is doing a fantastic job in this film. He really knocks it out of the ballpark. Now, what I will say, though, is that there's, of course, with any sort of movie where it comes to strange characters like this, there's always going to be a bit of iffiness, a bit of controversy, especially after what happened, especially after, just the general climate going on right now with the increases in gun violence and everything, and just the overall fact that the Joker is not a hero. He is obviously a villain. I mean, anybody who even has heard of the Joker, you don't even have to have seen a movie or read a comic book, knows he's not a very, nice guy. But it's very interesting the way they play that in the movie, of how they don't look at him from that classic sort of lens as I've always been evil, If anybody has seen the Dark Knight, they know that Joker's sort of theory in that movie, you could say, is that all it takes for madness is just someone to have one really bad day. And seeing this movie is like that one really long, stretched out bad day for the main character. And it's incredible. I definitely would recommend it. Now, on the spookier side of things, however, there's a ton of great, absolutely fantastic horror movies out there. Most people know about movies like The Conjuring, which is obviously fantastic. Insidious, good, but it's a little iffy. Paranormal Activity movies give me the shivers from how terrible they are, but, everybody's got their thing. If your thing is being able to sit there for 5 hours and wonder what's going to happen next, and that next thing is, the drawers fly open, and that scares the hell out of you, more power to you. I do believe they got only the second Paranormal Activity movie on Hulu for some reason. Don't know where the rest of them went. Conjuring, Insidious, I do believe the second Sinister as well is also on Netflix for anyone who has it. However, I want to talk about some movies that maybe some people listening might not know about. For instance, a very fantastic horror movie. Now, this is labeled as a horror movie, but it's also more of like a sort of dark comedy movie. It's called Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Now, I know that sounds a bit funny, a bit awkward, maybe it doesn't sound very spooky, and it's really not. It's not very spooky, but it is really a fantastic film that sort of deconstructs the general idea of, the whole cabin in the woods sort of storyline. Now, this movie, two main characters are like two, classic country boys, and they just want to renovate their house that they bought. It's a nice little cabin in the woods by the lake. Nice is a relative term. It's pretty torn down. Nobody's lived in it for years, but he's like, you know what? This is gonna be my dream. This is my lake house. I want you to help me renovate this. And then they kind of get party crashed by this group of teenagers who mistakes them for serial killers who are hiding in the woods. And obviously madness ensues from there, and it's an absolutely hilarious movie, and it's just a really great film overall. And that's on Netflix for anybody who likes to watch it. I believe the runtime is about hour 30, and it's definitely not for the faint of heart. I will say there's a bit of gore, as I do get with a lot of these sort of movies. Excuse me. And speaking of gore, a movie that sort of made itself famous from its gore is The Evil Dead. Now, The Evil Dead is by far one of the greatest horror movies. Like, indisputable. It's absolutely fantastic. I personally got the chance to rewatch it the other night, and I was like thrown back 2 years ago when I first started getting into horror movies. And my God, is it just like the atmosphere that Sam Raimi is able to create. And yes, that is the same Sam Raimi who directed the Spider-Man trilogy. You know, the one with Tobey Maguire, the classic emo Spider-Man, the Spider-Man everyone grew up with. But The Evil Dead is truly just a great work of cinema from the point of not only is it a great horror movie, but the fact that a lot of the effects are all practical. Like, I'm pretty sure most of, if not all of, the special effects having to relate to the zombies and all of the other monsters and such, and all of just the general creepy, like, gory stuff that happens in this film, it's all practical effects. And I really like practical effects from a personal standpoint, because when you have really good practical effects, then it's also up to the caliber of the actors to like sell that practical effect. You know what I mean? Like, you can have a really great practical effect, but if the actor can't really sell that and be like, yeah, this is real, this is happening, then it's not going to work as well. But honestly, the way that the movie follows Ash Williams through having to deal with all this crazy shit with finding the Book of the Dead in this creepy old cabin and all the other horrible, awful stuff that happens in the movie, it's great. It really is like chilling too, because of how well the actor Bruce Campbell really is able to sell that, despite the fact that Bruce Campbell himself really sees himself as more of a comedic actor. Which, side note, if you are interested in the Evil Dead trilogy, because it is a trilogy actually, I would highly recommend watching the other two movies. The Evil Dead 2, in which it takes place right after the first movie. Like, literally picks up pretty much at the last scene, and you get to really do a sort of really interesting, like, character focus on Ash Williams, and you see him slowly deteriorate mentally through this film. But On the flip side, as opposed to the first movie, the second movie is a lot more comical. It's absolutely hilarious. Just all of the crazy shit that goes on in the second movie. It's an absolute ride, and I would highly recommend it to anybody who is interested in like really interesting, like strange comedy that might be a bit more on the bit more on the spooky side. And of course, rounding out that trilogy would be Army of Darkness, which just takes all of the horror stuff, throws it right out the goddamn window, and teleports our main character Ash Williams, again picking up right from the last scene of the second movie. It throws him right into a portal that takes him to the Middle Ages, and he has to fight all the same sort of enemies, got to fight zombies and skeletons and all that other stuff. While he's not only in the Middle Ages, he doesn't have a hand anymore, which he then attaches a chainsaw to his arm instead. And that movie is just absolutely wild. So if you guys are interested in more of a funny camp sort of movie, definitely would recommend the second two, or the other 2/3 of the Evil Dead trilogy, Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness. If you're interested in something more spooky, then definitely just recommend the first Evil Dead. Now, there is a remake of the first Evil Dead that doesn't really have Ash Williams as a character. However, they do sort of replace that sort of character with one of the other characters and make her the focus of the film. And, you know, the way that they play about her makes it a lot more layered, I guess you could say. There's a lot more like sort of symbolism when it comes to this specific portrayal. However, that movie is a bit more of a mess because it wasn't directed by the same person, so it doesn't have the same exact vision, but it does have a lot more of what I would say people in modern would probably feel a bit more scared by. You know, a bit more of that classic sort of like absolute like gore and like demons and monsters, all that really just cool stuff. Other great movie though, I actually got to see this last night. I haven't even seen it or really heard of it before that. Eli. Now this is a new movie on Netflix. It's about a young boy who is sort of allergic to everything. You ever see in those movies where there's a character who's like allergic to like so much of the outside world that he's got to stay in like the bubble? It's kind of like that. So this kid finds out that in order to essentially cure himself, him and his family they're going to this special clinic. Well, it's more of like a large creepy house. It's very creepy. If anyone listening has seen The Woman in Black, which I would also recommend the Woman in Black movie. It's a fantastic film. But it sort of gave me a similar vibe in the beginning to The Woman in Black, because that movie has a big sense of isolation when it comes to the main character. And being able to see him traveling to the castle each time in the movie brought up a similar sort of sense when I was watching Eli. And, you know, he's in his car. Well, not in his car. He's in the car with his family. And they're driving to this very secluded, large house. It's more like a mansion, really. It's very, like, old Victorian sort of design. And it's all, like, it's dark. It's foggy. And there's, like, nothing else except for this house. It feels like this house is just in the middle of nowhere. And then you'd really have to go out of your way to even find the place. And, you know, that's just the beginning of it. Because then, as with any movie that takes place in a creepy old house that's been abandoned for years, there just so happens to be a strange occurrence, you could say. A strange collection of occurrences. As Eli continues his treatment, he begins to see some spirits, as one could call them, and begins to wonder what's real and what's not. Sort of similar, I guess you could say, to the Joker movie when you watch it and you sort of wonder if what you're seeing is real and if it's just the main character's imagination. Especially because part of the movie, part of Eli rather, is sort of making you yourself question whether or not the main character is a sort of reliable narrator, you know, whether or not you can really trust this little kid who's telling you everything that's going on. Now, of course, since he's the protagonist, you're supposed to, as with most films, but, you know, have you ever seen other movies, especially Joker? I guess you could really flip back onto that. Joker as a character is a very unreliable narrator. Like, you don't know whether or not at certain points he's hallucinating or whether or not he's actually crazy or what's really going on in his life. And I really enjoy that in a horror movie, being able to really question what's going on. Like, is this character really seeing these things? Is this character actually crazy? If anybody has seen Shutter Island, that's like a huge theme of that movie, is just the general questioning of reality. And even the main character goes through that of questioning whether or not everything is real. Shutter Island, I also believe, is still on Netflix. If it's not on Netflix, I think it might be on Amazon Prime. But yeah, absolutely fantastic film. I'd highly recommend it. I will say that there is a twist. There is a twist. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I'm not going to spoil it for you. What kind of host would I be? But I will say the twist is going to feel like it came straight out of left field. I will say that. You're definitely going to be surprised. Now dialing it back to a bit more classic, bit more back to the practical effects and everything. I think same sort of, I think it was the same decade that Evil Dead came out, the original movie. Alien actually released. Now, some people may know Alien as a fantastic sci-fi movie, but it really is also an amazing horror movie. Even just denying the fact that it takes place in space. Like, the fact that they are on this massive ship, and it's only like 9 people, all in this huge ship, you start to realize just how much space there is for this creature to just be lurking. For this creature to just be there right out of sight. And you don't even know when he's going to strike next, who he's going to strike next. And there's this very eerie feeling when you're watching the movie that really I have not been able to see replicated in a lot of modern horror movies. But I also admire the fact of the way that they treat the alien as well. A lot of movies, for instance, in the modern, spoil it by showing the monster too much. It's sort of like an exposure effect. By seeing the monster so many times in a modern horror movie, it doesn't feel as scary a lot of times. Now, this is also sort of a product of older horror movies, specifically the domination of slasher movies. Scream is a huge one. I Know What You Did Last Summer, which is a terrible movie, but it definitely goes into that whole sort of genre. Sorry, I just had to move something. It definitely goes into that sort of whole thing of showing off a bit too much, especially if anybody has seen the Friday the 13th, Halloween, or especially the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. Those show Freddy and Jason so much from one point because, yes, you have to because they're the killer, but also, especially with Nightmare on Elm Street, the more movies they made, because they were showing Freddy so much, the more ridiculous it felt. And as a result, the more ridiculous the movie itself got, which was kind of funny. Like, they just stopped doing these kills with Freddy where it was very abrasive and, like, you actually felt sort of, I don't want to say repulsed, but really you were sort of grossed out. You'd see something gory and you would be shocked by it. But instead, they started to do like more goofy things. I can't think of something off the top of my head, but like as those Friday the 13th movies went on, they just got like weirder and goofier. And then they tried to remake it in the 90s with, I believe it was called Wes Craven's A New Nightmare. And that was also a sort of strange film in itself. However, I digress. If you really are looking for a good horror movie, the first Alien. Don't watch Prometheus, Alien Covenant, Aliens, or Alien 3, any of those other movies. If you're looking for a scare, definitely just watch the first Alien movie. Now, I will say that a large market for current horror movies is found footage films. A lot of people know found footage films mostly from movies like I had mentioned before, like the Blair Witch Project. But I didn't mention the Blair Witch Project before. Rather, I mentioned Paranormal Activity. Paranormal Activity really shot found footage films back into a spotlight that they hadn't been in for, quite a bit of time. They were still there, don't get me wrong, but it was definitely something that wasn't as thought of when it came to, we can make a great movie out of this. The original Blair Witch Project is really just riveting if you're a bit more of the faint of heart. If you're a bit more into that whole like suspense feeling, because there's a lot of tension in that film, especially the longer it goes on, the more you feel that tension build of these kids being lost in the woods and they have no idea what's happening, and there's weird monstrous noises at night, and these symbols keep appearing everywhere, and these little totems and stuff. Now, I will say the new one, the remake of the Blair Witch Project that they made, I believe it was 2 years ago, was not terrible. Don't get me wrong by any sense of the means. It was not a terrible film. But I do feel like it underserved the original premise of the Blair Witch Project by attempting to explain it a bit more, but also by attempting to show it a bit more. Which I will give that movie credit for. It did show the movie, but the movie showed the movie. It did show the monster. It did show the Blair Witch at a certain point, but not for long enough where it can really sit in your mind. Not for long enough where your brain can really register what it looks like, or like how ridiculous it might look, or how unrealistic. Just long enough for you to know it's there, which I really did appreciate, because then it added to the rest of the suspense of the movie. Sort of on the same subject of the Blair Witch, they recently made a video game about the Blair Witch. I believe it was just called The Blair Witch. And that is a bit iffy. But we're not here to talk about video games today. Maybe a bit later if we got the time for it. But I will say, if you're looking for a good found footage movie, same sort of vein as Blair Witch Project, there are a really good amount of them. Now, I will say, not every found footage movie is going to be for everyone. Found footage is one of those genres where, because it's so easy to make, there's a lot of filler. There's a lot of fluff. There's a lot of movies that were just made because someone could make them. Now, that's not to discredit the whole genre of found footage films. Rather, I just wanted to point out the fact that it makes it so that when you find a found footage film, when you find a found footage film, when you find one that really works for you and works for like what you personally find scary, or even if it's just something you personally enjoy, regardless of how scary you might feel it is, it sort of feels sort of satisfying. For instance, for me, there's two movies specifically that I can currently recall that I really enjoyed that are found footage films. Those two being Grave Encounters. There's Grave Encounters, and then there's Grave Encounters 2. Now, both these movies are sort of styled as lost. Well, rather, the first movie is styled as a sort of lost episode of a TV show that never got a chance to air. The company who produced the show somehow managed to find the footage after the cast of the show had gone missing, and they decided to re-edit it and turn it into a movie. And it's very interesting because the quote-unquote company that owns the TV show insists that the movie that we are watching is real, and that it was made before the people who made the show went missing, which is interesting because that's also another point that's sort of reiterated in the second movie. But the first movie is fantastic because of the use of the different effects that they have. Now there is some CG and some funky stuff with that CG, but sort of similar to Alien and even the new Blair Witch, they don't show that CG to the point where you start to feel like it's not doing anything. You start to feel like it doesn't really have as much of an effect because you're getting used to it. You know, when you see it, it's like deliberately put in that specific scene to like just scare the hell out of you. And it's not put in like so many scenes to where you're going to be like, oh, this is going to be one of those scenes where something spooky is going to happen. Now, obviously, there are going to be points with any horror movie where you can definitely see like, oh, there's like a creepy kid in the corner. Obviously, that's going to be a jump scare or, you know, stuff like that. But, you know, with the first movie, it really is an interesting ride because these characters don't really know what's going on, which is a common aspect of a lot of found footage films, actually, is that the characters themselves really just have no idea, and they're sort of supposed to be just as scared as you are, in a sense. Now, what's interesting about the second movie is that it treats the first movie like it exists in the universe of that movie. And so it's interesting because it comes from the standpoint of a film director, or I think it's a film student, not a director. But he's like a college kid, and he reviews movies online, and he's like, oh yeah, Grave Encounters, this movie sucked or whatever. And then he gets this mysterious email telling him to investigate the movie. And so he's like, you know what the hell, I'll investigate it. So he starts looking into it, and he starts to find out that maybe this movie isn't as fake as he thought it was. And it all, of course, comes to a head when him and his friends decide to go to the haunted asylum that the cast of the first movie wound up in. And, of course, all of the spooky stuff ensues that normally would in that situation. But it's definitely interesting to see like the different visual ways that they are able to create this atmosphere, because it's not limited to ghosts. It's not limited to monsters. It's not just, they're not just fighting to try to get out of this hospital. They're not like trying to go through all these ghosts or whatever, because the asylum itself is sort of a character in a sense. The asylum itself is stopping them from getting out. Sort of in that vein of trying to trap different characters and trying to continue that cycle of being able to find people over and over again who are sort of that unwitting sort of sucker, you know? And that's a really interesting way of doing that, especially with the use of the found footage and being able to continue in that storyline. Now, there are, of course, going to be some stinkers with any genre, but they're definitely movies you can watch if you'd like. If you're not necessarily feeling like watching something that's going to scare you, but you want to get in that sort of spooky mood, For those sort of movies, I would definitely recommend a movie like Sinister. Now, Sinister, I will preface this, most people are going to get uncomfortable watching Sinister. That is not because of any specific problems with the movie itself, sort of. It's more so with the specific subject matter of the movie. Now, for anybody who hasn't seen Sinister, I would actually recommend this movie. It's a good movie. It's just not a good horror movie, and it's intended to be a horror movie, which sort of what bumps it down for me. But I feel like you could definitely get some awkward laughs and some stifled chuckles out of it. Now, the plot of that is that a author... Oh, God, excuse me. Whoa, I don't know what just came out of my mouth. The premise of Sinister is that an author, him and his family, move into this house. And, he's an author who has made, like, one good book. And he has never been able to make another good book, and that has haunted him, sort of. So already you have that sort of interesting, like, character who's got this dedication to what's going on in the film. And so what he does is he's like, I'm going to write this true crime novel. Because he discovers that there have been this slew of killings dating all the way back to, I believe it was the 50s. And it's very interesting because each of them is very specific. He actually in the movie charts out a line of like where it goes and how it travels and everything like that. And it's interesting because you start to think in the beginning, maybe this movie is going to be a little different than what it seems to be billed as. Maybe they specifically are trying to like throw me off with how they're portraying the movie. And it sort of comes into that with while discovering the house, while cleaning it up and everything, he finds these Super 8 tapes that look to be rather videotapes of the serial killer, rather of his victims. And it's very interesting because in one of those films, we don't know this at the time, I believe, but then when you're watching it, one of those films looks like it happens in the same backyard. And then you find out a bit later in the movie that he moved into that house because it was the house of one of the families who had died. And so that creates a lot of tension with him and his family, and just a lot of general tension of like unease and all of this other stuff. Now, once it starts to get more like further down the line, I'm not entirely going to spoil it, but I will say that it's iffy, because of the way that the villain is sort of presented. Now, we're going to take a break. Well, for you, rather, it's going to be just a couple seconds, not even really. And when we get back, we are going to be talking about some current event stuff. Now, don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a flash. And we are back. Now, before we start our conversation, I just want to get a word from our sponsor, Pants for Dogs. Now, if you have a dog like me, then you've often thought to yourself, how do dogs wear pants? Well, this product is for you. With Pants for Dogs, you no longer have to wonder whether or not dogs wear pants on all four legs or just two. Pants for Dogs. If you would like to order your own Pants for Dogs, go to pantsfordogs.com and get yourself a pair. They come in all sizes and for all breeds. Now, I have with me fellow student and lovely individual, Selena.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about some of the current events going on.
Okay.
Now, a lot of people who've been keeping up with the news probably have heard about all the stuff going on with the impeachment of the President of the United States. For those who don't know, give you a quick rundown of why he's being impeached. There was essentially a call that was made between him and the president of Ukraine, in which he essentially said, if you don't investigate Joe Biden, we won't give you military aid. Then, the craziest part about this is the fact that not only did he admit it on camera that he did do this, but then his chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, also admitted it on camera last week. Not only did he admit it on camera in a press conference, but he said, get over it.
Love our president.
Right? It's crazy stuff. And it just keeps getting crazier, too, because of the fact of how I believe it was mentioned that even there were some concerns from aides that he had been doing this with other foreign leaders. None of them have been named, but I don't think that it's far to say that he had probably been doing it with President Putin, and quite possibly even the current leader of, is it Turkey?
Yeah, I think it was Turkey.
Yeah. With that whole situation going on with him about abandoning our Kurdish allies. And that whole thing is absolutely insane, because then he attempted to say that him negotiating a ceasefire was like the greatest thing ever, despite the fact that he caused the fight in the first place. Right? No, I actually was finding it interesting about how did you hear about the ambassador to Ukraine that had testified recently?
No, I did not hear about that.
So essentially what had happened was the ambassador, or former ambassador to Ukraine, I believe he was former ambassador, he testified in front of the committee that was doing these impeachment proceedings, and essentially said that not only was he told that military aid was dependent on a meeting with President Trump for Ukraine, but anything that Ukraine needed from the United States or wanted from the United States or wanted to talk about with the United States was dependent on a meeting with President Trump. Which is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
And it's really funny, though, because of the fact of, like, so I think it was either this week or it was late last week, a group of Republicans stormed, quote unquote, stormed a hearing in which it was a closed door hearing. But out of all of these Republicans, I don't remember the exact number of how many actually, like, forced their way in there, essentially. But out of this, it was a pretty big group, but 47 of these people already had access to these closed door hearings. And I believe of those 47, 12 of them could have had the access to be able to sit in and on all of the hearings. And apparently, I had heard that some of them, even like when they were being questioned about how whether or not this was like legitimate or not, they asked to be arrested or something.
Oh my God.
Which is like
interesting.
The most middle-aged white thing to do. Not trying to like single anyone out, but they were definitely like, if you can find the footage online, it's all middle-aged white guys.
I wouldn't expect anything else. So.
Right, but you see, the irony of it is they're saying that these proceedings are against the rules and that these proceedings are like insane. But these proceedings were written out in 2015 and put into like signed into law by a Republican majority.
Yeah.
Like Republicans signed off on these rules that are currently being enforced onto the president.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not even like 4 years ago. I think it was like in like mid to late 2015 that this had happened. And now they're claiming that all of these crazy things that are happening, quote unquote crazy things, are against the rules and they're extra legal. I heard a lot of people trying to throw that phrase around. I thought one of the phrases from a lawyer who was present was interesting. He was quoted saying, "It is often said of trial lawyers that when the law is not on their side, they pound on the facts. When the facts are not on their side, they pound on the law. When neither the law nor the facts are on their side, they pound on the table."
That is a fantastic quote.
Yeah, and let me tell you, they are going hard on that table. I don't think we're going to have a table anymore after this. We might have to get a new one from...
It will be in shatters.
Yeah, we're going to have to get a new one from Goodwill. And it's really interesting seeing how the Republican defense is sort of deteriorating.
Yeah.
Because at first, a lot of Republicans were very much like defending the president. But slowly, as the impeachment keeps going on and people keep hearing about all the crazy shit that he's been doing, like in terms of foreign influence, like, I don't want to say a lot of Republicans, but there have been a decent number that have started to, I don't want to say defect, but like they've been sort of switching sides. They have changed to not being on the defense anymore, which I think is really interesting because a lot of people consider Republicans to be very steadfast in those interesting beliefs of theirs.
Yeah, it's really interesting that they're not defending Trump as much as they did.
Yeah, but it's funny because
going after him now.
It's a change of, it's a sort of switch of what they consider to be okay, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, when he was accused by, I believe the official number was 23 different women of
I think it was about that.
Sexual assault and sexual misconduct, that was fine.
When Stormy Daniels.
Yeah,
that
when
was
he,
fine.
when him and his lawyer had given hush money.
Yeah.
Not only had given hush money to a porn star to not affect his presidential run, but also used campaign funds to do so, and also attempted to threaten her into not talking about the situation. That was fine.
Yeah. The overall thing with Russia is completely fine.
Yeah, just the whole issue. I mean, even the Syria issue only really benefits Russia.
Exactly.
The whole issue with like the Kurds and Turkey and how that whole thing is unfolding and has been unfolding only really benefits Russia in the long run. And so it's very interesting to see how all of that is really going on. Now, it's also interesting because, as opposed to with former presidents, we have a current president who likes to tweet a lot. He spends a lot of his time on Twitter.
His best friend is Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because of like when he sends out a lot of his tweets, it's usually like in the middle of the night.
It is. It's always like a booty call to Twitter.
Right? I feel like, if I remember correctly, someone had looked into it and a lot of his tweets were sent between like 2 and 4 in the morning, which is very strange.
What is he doing?
Right? He's just not all there. There's actually a small... No, it wasn't really an investigation, but it was something that was pointed out on Twitter that I had noticed. He had, in one of the famous pictures that he took, I believe it was the picture like the taco bowl or whatever.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Taco salad.
Someone had zoomed in on that picture and saw that there was a drawer that was open that contained allergy medication that is known to be abused in the United States. Like, it's known that people essentially use it to get high.
Oh my god.
And it contained like a shit ton of it. Pretty much the entire drawer was just like that. And
Oh my god. They're all taking the meds, I guess.
Yeah, so he's not completely sane, but it's interesting because we get to follow up on like essentially his thought process.
Yeah.
And
see how much of a dumbass he really is.
Right? But for instance, one of the things that has sort of added to this whole fire going on with the impeachment is the fact that he referred to the impeachment process as a lynching.
Oh, yes, he did refer to it like that.
Which, of course, caught the eye of pretty
Everyone.
much every, like, news outlet.
And that's
And
just ridiculous.
yeah, it also caught the attention of course, the Democratic front-runners and really just everybody who's currently running for president on the Democratic side. I'm not entirely sure what the reaction was on the Republican side, because I do know there are currently 2 people running on the Republican side against Donald Trump. I do not know who they are.
I can't remember.
But I can guarantee you it's 2 white guys.
It probably is. Yes, that might be accurate.
Only might be accurate. It's
But
like a 50-50.
I think that Lindsey Graham responded to it. I don't know if he.
Yeah, I don't.
He said that he said it was justified that Trump said that it was a lynching, even though he's just,
Yeah,
Lindsey Graham. Matters.
I don't remember where I saw. I think it was one of the articles I was reading regarding the subject, but I remember someone saying that the reason that Trump referred to it as a lynching is because there is no word for a white man being held accountable of his actions.
So lynching.
Right? But I think that's kind of funny because of all the things you could have gone to.
Lynching.
Yeah, but it's sort of interesting because of the language that he uses. Like, for instance, like witch hunts, like the entire history of witch hunts is very much not only like misogynistic because it went against pretty much any woman who didn't fit into the puritanical view of a woman, but it also was very othering because it basically anybody who didn't practice like the same way you did, even if you were both Christians, if one person practiced Christianity differently, they could be a witch.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fun fact: when Protestantism was on the rise, Catholics actually were persecuted as witches. Fun facts.
A lot of people were persecuted as witches and weren't even witches. They found out later on.
So like that's using that sort of language of that has been used against people who have been othered and marginalized throughout history really shows and is showing a lot of people just how much he doesn't really care, I guess you could say, but also how biased, I guess you could say, history sort of is.
Mm-hmm.
Because, with like the lynching comment, a lot of people are starting to like know a lot more about like that sort of era of history. We were talking in Colorline in my I have a class where we go over the history of race in America, which is a bit complicated because it's being taught by a white lady, but that's fine.
Prescott College.
Yeah, it happens. But we were talking about how, for instance, people like Andrew Jackson are still like talked about in a way that's very glorifying.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that not only did he massacre hundreds of thousands of indigenous people across America, but he did it against the ruling of Congress and the Supreme Court. Just completely without any regard for what the law was. He just took out militias and decimated entire communities. And yet we still refer to him as the father of the Democratic Party.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because of the different ways that people are being viewed, but also the way that that view is changing.
Yeah, no.
Like with Columbus Day being changed in a lot of states. I don't think it's become a national thing yet, but I do know a lot of countries, not countries, what am I talking about? A lot of states have adopted Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. I think actually Washington, D.C. adopted that instead of Columbus Day.
That sounds about right. That sounds like something Washington, D.C. would actually do. I don't know if Arizona has quite yet.
Well, I'm not entirely sure either, yeah. I definitely think that that's something that would be worth looking into. If you're listening and you're interested, Google it. But it's very much interesting to see how like all these different things are changing and being viewed. I remember when I was in high school, like I still learned that Columbus was like this great guy.
Yeah, 1492 and then, sailed the ocean blue.
Like 2 years later, my brother was talking to me about how he learned about all of the terrible, horrible things that Columbus did, how he cut off people's hands and like wore like people's severed ears as a necklace.
Yeah, my mom's actually my mom's a vice principal at a school in Phoenix, and they just started teaching kids that he's not a good person just last year, I believe.
Yeah, but this has been information that's actually been out there for like hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about I know this is a huge deviation from the current topic, but it's definitely like relevant to the current situation. But for instance, the reason that we view Columbus the way we do now is actually because of Italian immigrants. So when Italian people started coming over, there was of course that huge divide, as with any time immigrants come from another country to America, of America being like, hey, screw you guys, you suck, you'll never be Americans.
Yeah. And
essentially they used a romanticized autobiography that made up a bunch of stuff about Columbus, because someone who was writing biographies at the time just had to write about Columbus for something, I can't remember what the specific reason was, and found out that he was really boring and his only actual accomplishment was coming to Central America once and not even discovering a new route to India. They also discovered that he thought that the Earth was shaped like a pear. Right? Which is nuts. But also, so they used that romanticized version of Columbus to sort of be like, hey, we're Americans too. Look at this guy. He's from where we're from. And he discovered America. Yeah. Quote unquote. Yeah. Now we know he discovered a small set of islands in Central America and killed hundreds of thousands of people, I believe. But it's insane, like how that information has been there for years, but we didn't want to teach our kids about it, and even just teach adults about it. Like I feel like once you get into high school, that's the age where you should be able to learn about that stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I remember the look on my teacher's face when I corrected him about, I believe it was the how Native American people were treated when it came to like the Trail of Tears and all that kind of stuff, because the book we were reading from basically talked about it like it wasn't a big deal. Yeah. And we're like, oh, they just all decided to go that way. The U.S. government didn't send troops to forcefully take them out west and would shoot anybody who wasn't keeping up, and would just horribly treat these people. And you know, it's interesting because of how schools are sort of changing in that regard. And I definitely would be interested to see how that's going to affect people going forward, you know, how they're the changes in how they're learning history.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like we learned about the Holocaust really young.
Yeah, and that's sort of an irony, right? Because we learned about the Holocaust, and I remember in high school my teacher asked me the question. This was before I knew enough to say no. Um, but, or rather to answer differently, rather. But the teacher asked the question to us, do you think we would have learned the same lesson if the Holocaust didn't happen? And if I knew what I know now back then, I would have said no. Because of what happened in America with indigenous people, and how not only were they absolutely massacred, but how we've marginalized them to the point where like poverty is so normalized in their communities now.
Yeah.
Like, I believe I can't remember which tribe it is, but there's a tribe that has this massive I don't want to say a massive amount of land, but their reservation essentially is the size of like almost 3 states. In that entire reservation, there's only 13 grocery stores.
That is insane.
And that's a big problem that a lot of people don't talk about when it comes to poverty, is just the lack of access to food.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, even just not being able to have food is so affecting to people. Like, a lot of people talk about obesity and the rise of obesity and all these other health conditions, but they don't talk about the fact that, you know, if I need to get groceries, I have to travel like 10 miles to a grocery store.
When there's probably a McDonald's right next door.
When there's like a McDonald's or a convenience store or like a Dollar General, like maybe 1 mile away.
Yeah.
Or how basically America hates poor people. That's not, you know, that's not a jump.
Yeah.
You know, with how difficult it is to get food stamps, housing assistance, anything relating to welfare. But also the fact of how expensive it is to be poor.
No, for sure.
I mean, like, if you're poor, you're less likely to be able to buy things that could actually save you money.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on with my throat. I think it was something. I think it was that energy drink that I drank. It did sit out for.
That's why.
It did sit out for a bit too long.
Bangs. That's why.
Yeah. But, for instance, buying in bulk is a big thing that we do in America. Yeah. But if you're poor, that's not going to be something you're going to you're not going to be able to really do, because you're going to look at that and be like, I can get this thing that's going to cost me like technically twice as much as if I buy just one.
Yeah.
Despite the fact of I'm going to be able to use it longer, but I literally can't afford to get the bigger thing. But then you get into the irony of like the American dream. And again, I'm very sorry that this is such a huge departure from the original topic. But you get into the American dream and like that whole thing and how that's like perpetuated through our society. There's actually a survey that was done, I believe, in 2015 that found that 70% of Americans think that poor people can make it out of poverty on their own. Oh. Which is like absolutely insane, because
that's insane.
Yeah, it just denies the entire experience of being poor. I know that might sound weird, like, oh, there's an experience, but like when you're poor, you have so little opportunities afforded to you.
Yeah.
Like, you can't go and find another job because you're already spending so much time working at your current job. Like, and especially if your job is minimum wage, then like you're going to be spending endless amounts of time just trying to make rent, just trying to get food, just trying to make sure that you can have water so you can take a shower and flush a toilet.
Yeah.
Or even like have electricity so you can not like freeze. Yeah, it's, you know, absolutely insane just how like incredibly expensive it is to be poor in America. But it all goes back to again, history with the way that America was formed. It was essentially because slavery was such an integral part of early America. It America then evolved into a slave society that relied off of exploitation as work. But then once the Civil War ended, that just changed to like low paying jobs. And then especially with the Great Depression, fun fact, I don't know if you know this, and I know a lot of people don't know this. I told a server this when I used to work at Denny's, and they were like, they got really fucked up over it. The reason that servers don't make minimum wage, servers on general usually make about like less than $4 an hour.
Yeah.
Essentially is because of a Depression era. I don't even think it's a law. I think it's just like a custom sort of, or like a tradition, or I think it's some sort of clause that was put in that essentially what happened in the Great Depression was at that time tipping wasn't something that was allowed because America, we were all about land of the free, quote unquote, and treating everybody equally. So if you at that time were to tip your waiter, that would mean you were looking for like preferential service. You wanted your food to come out quicker, or you wanted it to taste better than it normally would, whatever.
Yeah.
And servers weren't allowed to do that. They weren't allowed to take tips. But what happened was eventually during the Great Depression, their bosses wouldn't have enough money to pay them. So they started taking those tips. And then once the bosses saw they were taking tips, they were like, oh, I guess I can pay you less. And so that eventually evolved into waiters not being able to make minimum wage at a lot of restaurants, which is really fucked up. Because, yeah, you can make a lot of money as a waiter. Don't get me wrong. But compared to what you have to do for work, like, it's not just a physical job. A lot of people think that being a waiter is just like you carry food, you take orders, that's it.
So much more than that.
But there's so much emotional labor that gets put into it too.
Memorization.
Yeah, you have to remember everything. You have to remember shorthand for different foods. You have to remember all the new foods, specials of the day. Yeah. But like the emotional labor that goes into it, remembering that you can't tell this customer to fuck off because you'll get fired, and you can't get another job. Or like, I can't call in sick today because it's a Friday and we're going to be so busy that my boss is going to fire me if I don't show up.
Yeah.
And a lot of waiters have to work on holidays and shit, which is really fucked up. Like when I worked at Denny's, it was mandatory that you work on holidays. Like I had to come into work on Thanksgiving and Black Friday and Christmas Eve and Christmas. Like I had to spend 12 hours in Denny's for every single holiday I worked there. And that was 12 hours that I was away from my family. And I wanted to throw my manager out the window. But like, it was mandatory. I had to do it. And I was getting paid more. But that doesn't justify the fact of like, I am not supposed to be working today. This is a day that I, as an American, am supposed to be spending with my family.
Yeah. It's amazing how much money can drive a person to do so much more work than they should.
You know what the irony of it is? I didn't even need that money because I was in high school. I wasn't saving that money for anything at the time. I was just spending it on random ass bullshit.
Yeah.
Like I would take, I would use my money and I would like go on dates with people, or I would just go and see a movie by myself, or fucking I think it was with my first check, I bought $100 Transformer.
What?
Yeah, right? And like I say that now, like thinking about how fucking crazy I was to spend $100 of my $300 check on a Transformer.
Yeah.
Now granted, it was like 5 Transformers that like turned into a big Transformer, but also that's $100 on a Transformer. And you know what that Transformer is doing? It's currently standing on my desk and I have not touched
it.
Doing
dust.
nothing. But I like looking at it. Yeah, since then, since I've gotten to college, I've been a lot more conservative with
Money.
how I spend money.
Yeah.
Even like with this job, I've been making sure that I budget everything out, that I'm only spending what I need to spend and all that kind of stuff, which is really interesting because of how like that mindset changes so quickly.
Yeah.
Like looking back on it, if I had saved like even a fraction of the money that I made when I was working at Denny's, which was only like maybe 8 months, then like I would have had a lot more money when I came to college, and I would have been able to survive a bit more. I mean, GMC wasn't too terrible. I originally went to a college in Vermont, Green Mountain College, and it was a bit more expensive than the one I'm currently at, but you also got meals every day.
Yeah.
Like you didn't have to buy your own food, which was...
I heard about that.
It was fantastic. Granted, the food wasn't always the best, but it was free food.
Free food is always the best.
Well, I say free food loosely because it was included in your tuition, but still it was food that you could count on being there every single day.
Yeah.
And you could take it home with you if you couldn't stay in the cafeteria. You could take a drink home with you. You could take your ice cream home with you, whatever the hell it was. And now that I'm working here, that's not really as much of a thing. You get some money for like a cafe, but like other than that, you gotta fend for yourself. Yeah. Sorry about the major departure from the topic. I don't know how we got from minimum wage jobs to or from impeachment to minimum wage jobs
to Transformers.
Transformers, right? But let's go a bit more back on track of the politics. What are you thinking about the current Democratic candidates? You keeping up with that?
It's hard because like I don't know. There's so many of them. They're all
I think
so
there's
different.
still like 15
Yeah, there's
running.
still, I think it's 12 or 15. Yeah. It's just a lot, and it's all like in my face, and I have no idea.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of them seem to be, I don't want to say copying, but it does feel like they're doing that.
Yeah.
It feels like a lot of them are copying sort of Bernie Sanders' original like platform from the 2016 election. The free college, free healthcare.
Yeah. It does seem like they're all talking about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because of how I remember there was a forum, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, about it was like a gay rights forum in which candidates went and people of the community could ask them questions about what their plans are for different things and all that kind of stuff. And it was interesting to see how, despite how supportive Bernie Sanders is when it comes to like equal rights for like literally everybody, like people of the LGBT community, people of color, like immigrants, everybody. Like it was interesting to see on like social media, a lot of people I noticed who were like of the community seemed to sort of jump on the fact, like really like try to use that to say that he is against like the trans community, like the LGBT community, because he wasn't there. Now, granted, he was having health issues for the past couple of weeks. There was a period of time where he did have a heart attack. He was in the hospital, but I mean, he's fine. And not only is he fine, but he was like, but he came out of the hospital and was like, see, this is why we need free healthcare.
Right there.
Yeah, right? Like, there's not a lot of people who, after having a heart attack, one of the first things they would be willing to say was, we need free healthcare so that people like me don't have to worry about paying bills, so that no matter who you are, if you go to the hospital, you don't have to worry about losing your house.
Exactly. Like,
me personally, I haven't gone to a doctor in like a year and a half because I can't afford it.
Yeah.
It was easier back home because I had state provided insurance, which some states do have insurance that is at a really low rate. or it's free. It's part of like a welfare sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was there, it was like I had no copays. If I had any medication I got, I didn't need to pay for it, which was like,
That's amazing.
it was amazing. Like, I don't know how it was so good, but it was fantastic. But then I come here and like I had no money for the first like 2 months when I was here. And they were like, you need a signed doctor's paper. You need a paper signed by a physician. Luckily, I was able to convince my old physician back in Pennsylvania to fax over
Nice.
a paper that was stamped, yes, they are a healthy individual.
That did take you a while. I do
It took
remember
me too damn long.
that. Yeah.
Mostly because they didn't have an email address, which is like,
Yeah,
you're a doctor's office. Why don't you have an email address? Why doesn't even the doctor have an email address that I can just send it to? Like, I went to this guy for like 6-7 years. Like, I think he should be comfortable with receiving an email from me. But yeah, I really think that's interesting because then you see a lot of different ideas being bounced around, especially Bernie Sanders recently said, of course he's against billionaires just as a concept.
Yeah.
And one of the things he recently tweeted was that billionaires should not exist. Now, of course, he didn't mean that, like, we should kill billionaires.
Well, yes.
What he meant was that the concept of a billionaire should not be something that exists. Like, we should not have somebody who has so much wealth that they will never realistically be able to use it in their entire lifetime.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because one of the people on the Democratic side who was running is actually a billionaire.
Interesting.
And there was a forum that took place, like it was last week or the week before. Actually, no, I do think it was last week. And that candidate was asked what he thinks about Bernie Sanders' comments that billionaires should not exist. And I was incredibly surprised by what he said. He actually agreed with Bernie Sanders that billionaires should not be a thing and that billionaires should not exist. And
I think it's like the concept of it.
yeah,
It just shouldn't be a thing.
I mean, I can understand.
No one should have that much money.
Yeah, I can understand certain points. Like millionaires are still a bit iffy for me. Like, like you're rich, but like that's still a lot of fucking money.
Yeah, honestly, realistically, you don't need all that money to live.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how like the wealth tax is being talked about. Like the proposed wealth tax by I know Bernie Sanders himself proposed a wealth tax. I do believe Elizabeth Warren also proposed a wealth tax.
Did as well, too.
I believe she said she wanted to tax for anyone who makes over $50 million to tax 2 cents per dollar that they make over that, which is like, it might not sound like a lot, but if someone makes like $200 million, then like that's a lot of money that then is going into government programs, that's going into Social Security, it's going into Medicare, that's going into like all of the things that people use and need like in their daily lives that could go into Medicare for all, for instance. And it's really interesting to see the fact of like, for instance, I believe it was the Washington Post. There did an article about how the wealth tax will hurt common Americans, right? But then something that people might not know is that Jeff Bezos himself, he's actually not the world's richest man anymore. I can't remember who is, but I think as of last week, he's not the world's richest man. But he himself owns the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Not Amazon. Like, he personally owns the Washington Post.
Jesus Christ.
Right?
That's a lot.
So, like, imagine being so, like, comfortable and conceited with where you stand in life that you're willing to, like, lie. It reminds me of, have you ever seen, like, those television preachers?
No, I don't think so.
No, like a Joel Osteen or like
No.
Peter Popoff or
No.
whatever his name. It's something Popoff, I know. But essentially, they are these people who run mega churches.
Okay.
because churches aren't taxed
Mm-hmm.
because people are crazy and don't know how laws work and don't know how to read the Constitution that says that there's a separation between church and state. Semantics. So it was really interesting to see how that there's a similar sort of rhetoric, I guess you could say, that's peddled between billionaires and megachurch, like people who like run megachurches. I don't want to call them priests or pastors or anything like that, because like if you believe that like your exorbitant wealth that you can never truly use is like a gift from God, I don't think that you truly understand the Bible.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was Jesus himself who said that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven.
Interesting.
Despite that, you see all these crazy people like Kirk Cameron famously does these movies where he like it's all Christian propaganda basically. Like there's one called Kirk Cameron Saves Christmas, and it's basically just this guy at a Christmas party who like doesn't believe in Christmas because of like he basically doesn't believe that the way we celebrate today truly honors Jesus. And that's a valid argument, you could say.
I guess
It's a different version
yeah.
of that. But then in the movie, instead of him like offering an actual argument to that, he just tells him vague stories, and then the guy's like, I guess it does honor Jesus. And then the movie ends with that guy breakdancing.
I mean, okay.
Right? You have a lot of like these weird movies that are like Christian movies that are made by like mega churches and that are like strictly Christian propaganda, and it's really interesting to see how they're made, because a lot of them peddle the idea of like, I'm rich because God made me rich, and by me being rich I can help you succeed because I have such a connection to God because he made me so rich, and the more rich I am, the more connected to God I am. Right? Or like there was a huge thing a while ago where people realized that these people who did the mega churches used private jets to get around, and they were like, hey, wait a minute, that's not really an appropriate use of the money we're giving you. And they were like, oh, you don't understand. See, when you're on a plane, you are surrounded by demons.
Oh.
And I was like, on one hand, I would describe that small child kicking the back of my seat as a demon.
Yes.
On the other hand, no. Like, it's very interesting, just like that whole difference between those two. And, yeah, I think that there's a really interesting point that's being thrown around of, like, the idea of billionaires. But also, like, even just the idea of how we think of money, at least in America. I mean, like, how related money is to, like, the climate. I can't talk. I definitely should not have had that energy drink. But how money is related to the climate crisis, and how, like, all of this science has basically been silenced for years in favor of making money, of, getting more oil, doing more fracking, all this crazy stuff. And it's interesting because there was a recent report that was published that said that it only would take $300 billion total to give us 20 more years to solve the climate crisis. So to explain that a bit more, it would take $300 billion to enact all of the changes we would need to get another 20 years to figure out what to do. But in the grand scheme of things, that might sound like a lot. That's less than half of the United States military budget for a year. Less than half. I find it, like, incredibly interesting, just like how that is like even considered. Like the as of 2019, the budget for the U.S. military is $693 billion. Still, that's a lot of goddamn money,
Yeah.
especially when considering how much we really don't need to use any of that.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I'm not saying that we don't need a military, obviously. I'm just saying that, like, a lot of what we use our military for is not necessary.
Yeah, for sure.
You get a lot of us just invading places just because we can.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting to look at all of that history, or how people don't talk about the different ways that Congress has used war to make money for themselves. Like how Dick Cheney made money out of the Iraq War, how, George W. Bush kind of also did the same thing. He made money off the Iraq War. And, all the other shit that happened during the time he was elected. But, like, it's interesting to see how we can view that as a country.
Yeah.
Because, you heard probably about what happened with Ellen.
I think I did. I'm not sure.
So she was at a basketball game? No, she was at a football game. And she was in, like, this special, like, seating booth with, like, a bunch of other, like, famous rich people. And she was seen sitting next to George W. Bush.
Mm.
And she got a lot of shit for it.
Oh. I mean, okay.
Well,
Yeah.
It's because of the fact of the way that she sort of talked about it as well, that also caused a problem. Because essentially the way that she talked about it was as if, like, having such large political differences was so small. Because she talked about it as if, like, being friends with someone who's basically a war criminal, who's considered by many to be a war criminal, pretty much, is fine because you just have different political views. But that also eliminates the fact of not only did he make money off of all these wars and only really get a second term because of said wars, but also of the fact of, like, he is one of those people who has staunchly been against, like, gay rights.
Yeah.
And, like, it's interesting to see how like, media and a lot of people in, like, the dominant sort of narrative want to try to put out the I don't want to say the narrative or, like, the question, but, like, sort of, like, I guess the idea more so that it's fine to be friends with somebody who's so diametrically opposed to your views. And I don't disagree with, you can be friends with somebody who has different views than you. I mean, like, I'm friends with somebody who's Republican. And, over the summer, I also, when I was living here over the summer, I lived with someone who was very much, like, a Trump supporter, which is something that obviously I'm not as a trans woman of color. Right?
Yeah.
And then, but there's a difference between somebody who has a different political view of, like, oh, well, I disagree with you on how high this building should be in this residential area, and I disagree with who counts as a person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a huge difference. Like, I've noticed people trying to pass out the narrative that Nazis are okay, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you see it a lot. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but it was during a pride parade where the police escorted a group of neo-Nazis through the parade for the specific reason of essentially letting them harass people during the parade.
I did not hear about that.
I mean, that's not what the official reason for it was, but that's what they did.
Yeah.
Like, while they were being escorted through this area, they, like, tore down signs. They attempted to assault people, if I remember correctly. I believe they took someone's sign. One of the Nazis took someone's sign and pissed on it. And this is all while they were being escorted by police in full view of the police.
Yeah.
So, like, it's interesting to see, like, how one group of people wants peace so badly that they're willing to give up what makes peace.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to, I know this might sound odd, but it's by being intolerant of intolerance that peace becomes more possible. And I know that might take a moment to, like, register, because it does sound like a weird statement, but essentially, like, when you allow ideas that diminish other people as people to become more dominant, then you're not truly believing in what you're preaching when it comes to like freedom and everything like that. Because you know, I remember someone once said that in the Constitution, when I believe it was the 14th Amendment was signed, that we the people stop meaning we the people who are white.
Yeah.
And, you know, I you know, believe that there is still that spirit there of we want to believe in equality and freedom and all of these other things, but there's also, like, so much that takes away from that, that it becomes a lot harder for people.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, change is difficult.
Yeah, and I think it's not necessarily the change that's difficult. I think it's the idea that change is difficult.
Yeah.
Because you always hear that in life, that change is difficult. But, I mean, for me personally, I feel like part of who I am is, like, I don't want to say absorbing, because that sounds a bit like alien, but sort of like just taking in the change and, like, really, like, letting that become a part of me without taking away from what it is.
Yeah, I mean, changing is hard, but I feel like I change all the time.
Yeah.
Views change and all kinds of stuff changes.
Yeah, and that's something that I find to be personally interesting. I mean, I really enjoy being able to talk with other people, and I don't want to say change their point of view, but, like, more so inform them, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I'm a history major, and that's one of the reasons that I like being a history major and why I want to work specifically in museums, because museums are a specific way of informing people.
Yeah.
And when you can inform people and make it fun and interesting, they're less likely to act in a way that's not going to make them susceptible to that idea. I mean, I can't remember who it was, but I remember when we went to the res, me and you and the rest of our class, the guy who originally had talked to us, he told a joke that was from some famous comedian who is also a social activist.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember.
It was a really good joke.
I can't remember who it was, but it was the joke was something along the lines of a good I think it was like a good social justice comedian can make you laugh to the point where they can slip in little bits of knowledge, and if they're really careful, a finger too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was something like that, and I think that that's interesting because of how I was talking actually about this in one of my other classes about the rise of edutainment, which is education entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that started with, as kids, we watched shows like Bill Nye, and I don't remember what it was called. It was like Beakers something. It was like about this guy who was like this crazy mad scientist, and like it was also a similar sort of thing like Bill Nye, where it was like this crazy mad not mad scientist in Bill Nye's case, but it was like this scientist dude, and he was like teaching you all about these different things. It was done in a fun, weird, wacky way to the point where as a kid you were paying attention, but it didn't feel like you were learning.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Crash Course does that too, I guess.
Yeah, and then that I feel increased as you went into the later 2000s with like mid to late 2000s with Mythbusters, which a lot of people consider just be regular sort of entertainment, but there's a lot of educational value in that show. Like you can learn a lot about different like chemistry and robotics, all this different kind of stuff you can learn from the show. Like I know there's lots of things that I actually didn't know until I had watched that show, and did like all these different experiments because it was actually pretty scientific for the most part. And then there's a show recently that came out that I really enjoy, and I've talked about it in most of my classes, if I'm going to be honest. It's called Adam Ruins Everything.
I've heard of that show, actually.
Yeah, and it's this really interesting show about this guy who he comes in to like a situation, and he's sort of like the genie in a bottle. Like once he's let out, you can't put him back until he's told you everything he needs to tell you. And it's funny because he'll come in at the most like random point. And you know, each episode has a theme, so you can look through it, but it also is interesting because compared to other edutainment shows, you can actually find all of the sources that they talk about online. They have their own on the website for the show because it's on a network, and you know, they had different pages on the networks for the different shows. But if you go to that show's page, you can find the resources listed by episode.
That's interesting. Yeah,
they did a recent one about like the police and SWAT teams, and essentially how SWAT teams were encouraged to be used during the early stages of the war on drugs because the government paid police stations to use SWAT teams, essentially. And not only did they pay them to use SWAT teams, but they also helped them use or they helped them have SWAT teams by giving them old military gear. And when I say old military gear, I don't mean like a tank from 1952. I mean like they gave them an assault rifle that was used like for a year or so, or they gave them an armored vehicle that was lightly used or refurbished or something like that. Like they gave them actual military equipment like grenade launchers, all of this shit that people don't need, that a normal police station would never need in any circumstance. I mean, I think it's 8 out of every 10 SWAT raids doesn't even find a weapon on premise. Could you imagine that? And then you hear, and I think it's interesting with how social media affects like our views of all that kind of stuff too. Because I remember years ago there was this increase in swatting. Do you know what swatting is?
No.
So swatting essentially is when you quote unquote prank somebody by calling the police and telling them this person has a bomb, you need to raid them now. And then the SWAT shows up and like wrecks their fucking house. Not only do they wreck their house, but in a lot of cases SWAT teams will basically like beat the people on premise.
Oh my God.
They'll like shoot them no matter what. There was a case that happened where a SWAT team raided a house for no real reason. And that's another thing, that SWAT teams can raid anywhere for no real actual reason, just because they have a hunch that something might be there. They raided this house because they thought somebody might be there. And during their raid, they threw a flashbang into a baby's crib and almost killed the baby. I do believe he did die later because of what happened.
Yeah,
And they were
injuries and
just
stuff.
like, that's business. And you're just sitting there like, what?
What the fuck?
Yeah.
That's
and
insane.
it's interesting. Sort of going back into what I did want to talk about our next topic. I think it's interesting with the police how different communities are affected by it too. I mean, I feel like something that isn't talked about is how the LGBT community is affected by the police. I think there was a study that was done that found that more than half of the people in the study said that they would not feel comfortable going to the cops. And these were people who were in the LGBT community. More than half of these people said they would not feel comfortable going to the cops if they were in a situation that you would essentially want to go to them in.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe more than like an even higher percentage of trans people said that they wouldn't go.
I can understand that.
Yeah, and it all goes down to how it's that othering that I had mentioned before of how the way that we are talked about a lot of the time, especially like in the going back to like that dominant narrative, is there's a sort of lack of humanization a lot of the times. I mean, in bigger cities like New York, for instance, if you're a trans person, like walking like late at night at a certain period of time, you can be stopped by the police because they'll think you're a hooker.
Yeah.
For no other reason than they think you might be a prostitute. Like,
Yeah.
you can look however you want, but if they can look at you and be like, that person is trans, then they'll pull you over and be like, what are you doing? You know?
Mm-hmm.
But sort of going more into general sort of topics, LGBT community. So there's been a lot of, I don't want to say discussion because it's mostly been screaming, by a lot of people who don't really seem to fully understand what's going on about, so I can't remember if it was all companies or if it was just Always, the
I think it was
tampon.
just Always.
Yeah, so Always is a big feminine product company. I say
Mm-hmm.
feminine product, but you know what I mean? It's like stuff for your vajayjay.
I use them. They're good.
Yeah. They smell pretty nice too.
Yeah, they're
I had
fresh smells.
I had a nosebleed once, and I used to get really bad nosebleeds.
Tampon.
And yeah, my mom shoved a tampon up my nose. It worked extraordinarily well.
It
I was
does. It's
very
very
surprised.
absorbent,
And then
you
I
know?
had to go to the doctor, and he just yanked the tampon out of my nose, and it was just like a glob of blood the size of a small cupcake. It was gross. I vomited. I can still feel the taste of it in my mouth, and
That's gross.
my mouth now feels gross. No, I had this thing the other day where I felt like I had bitten into cardboard. I don't know why.
That's disgusting.
Yeah. So, the company Always, who's a major provider of products that individuals with vaginas use, recently removed the female symbol
Mm-hmm.
from their
Well,
packages.
They're going to get them all removed by December, is what
Yeah.
they said.
They announced that they were going to be removing them.
They'll no longer be manufacturing like that.
Yeah.
Anymore.
So they'll have more neutral packaging, which, in general, I can't think of a reason, even if there wasn't as much of a reason to do it with like trans people. I can't think of a reason that like this would happen that could really be a cause for outcry,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then you hear people complaining now about how trans people are trying to change the world and how we're trying to like force the world to change because we're changing. And it's funny because I've been hearing it a lot from people who have previously claimed that they are supportive of the trans community and of the LGBT community as a whole.
And they can't support this tiny little thing. That's
right. And I think it's interesting because of the fact of, like, it shows the fact of how fragile some people's safety feels, right? There's a lot of people who like to complain about, like, the trans community because despite the fact that, like, 99.999% of trans people ever have pretty much never done anything that would denote anyone feeling unsafe.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, you still have TERFs, which are trans excluding feminists. That doesn't just count towards trans women. That also counts towards trans men. If you don't know, the TERFs view trans men as women who don't know any better.
Yeah.
Which is ironic because that's a misogynistic view.
Yeah.
Yet they claim to be feminists.
Weird. Yeah, exactly. That's just really strange.
Yeah. And it's interesting because that's a sort of narrative that has affected a lot of trans men I've spoken with, saying that, like, you know, they felt like their identity was just internalized misogyny, but then they realized that's just who they are. And I found that to be interesting. But yeah, like, I have friends who are trans men. I have friends who are non-binary. I have friends who are all over the gender and sexuality spectrum. And, like, this is something that's very important.
Yeah, it is really important.
Like, for instance, as a trans woman, it's really hard a lot of the times when I go, like, shopping for clothes and stuff, because you'll see, like, labels, or you'll see posters or whatever of people wearing, like, the clothes that you're buying, and it sort of reminds you of what you're not or what you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And that's a huge thing for a lot of people. A lot of people don't realize just how affecting it is to trans people to constantly be reminded that they aren't considered to be normal. That they have to face all these different problems pretty much on their own for the most part. I mean, most medical companies don't even offer any assistance when it comes to, like, medical care in relation to being trans.
Yeah, there's not much.
have heard of cases of people getting around this, but it's very localized. Like, I've heard a case of one individual who got into a car accident, and then when speaking with their doctor, they essentially convinced them to do, like, some surgery to assist them in their transition. And because essentially it was surgery that they would have already been getting, but they asked them to, like, essentially tailor it, I guess you could say, like, change it a bit so that it was more to what they needed. And that was something that I found to be really interesting. That was, like, years ago, though, when I was first looking into this. But it's definitely hard for anybody in the LGBT community who doesn't fit on the gender binary to constantly be reminded of this kind of stuff. I mean, like, even, like, for instance, like, shoes. Like, I buy shoes a lot of the time, and men's and women's shoes are, like, constructed differently.
Yeah, they are.
Which is something that I didn't even really consider. Even when I'm buying shoes that are meant for a bigger person like me, they're still more narrow. They're still more, like, fit to the slim feminine ideal of what an individual like this would be. And I'm not saying that there aren't people like that. Obviously there are, because there's so many people in the world that it's inevitable that there's going to be people who would fit into a stereotype or an ideal.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to see how there's different reactions to that kind of stuff. Like, me personally, when I get a shoe and it's a bit slimmer, I don't really mind because I have to get my shoes custom made for the most part anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, it sucks. It really does because I have to pay a lot more than I normally would. But I was lucky enough that I found companies and stuff that are a bit more accommodating. That's the word I was looking for. And I really think that there's a lot of people who don't consider anything outside of what they know. And that's where a lot of this outrage is coming from.
Yeah.
I heard a study that was actually, this was last year or the year before, that a lot of people still felt uncomfortable in the workplace around trans and non-binary people, while they did feel comfortable around gay and lesbian individuals.
Gays.
Yeah. Which I found to be interesting because, for instance, I mean, I know I don't want to say most, but I know a lot of the non-binary individuals that I personally know they're not, there's no real reason that you would have to feel uncomfortable around them. And same with trans people. I mean, I can understand if you're one of those people who, like, is terrible with names or terrible with remembering pronouns and stuff.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we're not gonna like be a dick to you. Yeah. I mean, like,
mostly just correct and be like, hey, that's not right.
Yeah. I mean, I feel I have a non-binary friend that I've been hanging out with a lot more, and I'm still not used to saying they.
Mm-hmm.
And have you ever walked into a coffee shop like that isn't a Starbucks and you accidentally say like grande or venti or like something like that?
Yeah, no.
And then
sure.
you feel like a fucking asshole.
Yeah.
You feel like one of those pricks who constantly goes to Starbucks and like he knows their order. Like, I get that sort of feeling. Like, I get that feeling of like, I'm a terrible person. Why am I doing this? I need to be better. Like, that's the sort of feeling that I get whenever I mess up. And, you know, I don't mess up a lot, but it's something that, like, there is levels, I like to say. Like, if you're a sincere enough person and if the individual you're with understands that, you know, you might take a bit more time because you're not used to this kind of stuff or the other thing, then you're not going to have any problems. I mean, like, a lot of people get uncomfortable around me because I'm just bigger in general. I'm about like 6'2", and a lot of my friends are like, I say on average below 5'8".
Yeah, I'm 5'6", so.
Yeah. Are you're as tall as Adriana?
I am as tall as Adriana, yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, Zoe is 5'8", so.
She's got those inches on you.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I think it's sort of funny in a sense because of how little it actually really affects the people who want to complain about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it's sort of there's people. I was writing a paper the other night about my own personal experience and all that kind of stuff. I was writing for a class, and one of the lines I wrote was, those who say that we ask for too much have never known not enough. And I think that's something that a lot of people in this sort of context need to consider, is that, like, sometimes there are a lot of not enoughs when you're trans or non-binary. Like, for instance, it's not enough that my legal name is not what I consider to be my actual name.
Mm-hmm.
It will rather not what I consider to be my actual name, that it's not my actual name. It's not the name that anybody in the entire world who knows me calls me.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yet, if I want my email address for the school changed, I have to provide them with a legal document that says that I have changed my name to this name now.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's not enough that I have changed my name for some people, because they still get the wrong name put on their forums for the school. I heard there are some other
There's a teacher.
yeah, there's a teacher here.
Yeah, Alexis. Yeah, her name was her dead name when I went into her classroom, and it was like not the person I was expecting. And she's like, "That's my dead name, so don't call me that."
Yeah. For anyone who's listening, essentially a dead name is what one could consider your given name or your birth name.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's
Dead
the
to you.
name, yeah, that's dead to you. It's not who you really are.
Yeah.
Sort of like, I can't think of a comparison, but you understand.
Yeah, it's just a birth name.
Yeah, but it's also one of those things of like there's a lot of meaning behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, for sure. Your name is who you are, and if your name doesn't match who you are, then you don't want to be that name.
Right. I don't want to sound like I'm going to an extreme when I say this, but it is a similar sort of idea. But essentially, when you are called, when you're trans, when you're non-binary, and you are called by your dead name, that is like a level of disrespect that essentially for a lot of people is on par as using like a slur.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Like,
for
if,
sure.
like, there's such a deep level of just inherent disrespect with even the idea of thinking that it's okay for me to say this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That, like, there's a moment, and I felt this before, where, like, you kind of want to be mad.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's something that you shouldn't have to experience as a person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it shouldn't be as hard as it is for a lot of people. And I think that it's also, there's a lot of classism that goes into a lot of this too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, I think a lot of these people who are arguing about whether or not the female symbol should be on a box of tampons or a box of pads, like, don't really understand what it's like to not have to, or rather to have to feel like that sort of shame, that sort of dysphoria over like just existing. Like, I have friends who are trans men who like feel so awful whenever they have to go to see a gynecologist.
Yeah.
Like, but it's also like when you go there, when you go anywhere where you're expected to be one thing and you're not, or you know that because of who you are, you shouldn't have to be here, but because of how you were born, you need to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, there's a lot of classism that goes into it. I mean, like, a lot of people are like, what's so hard with changing your name?
Yeah.
I mean, but then they don't consider the fact of, like, you have to go to court.
Yeah.
You have to have money
Money
to pay for the fee to change your name,
Yeah.
which varies from state to state. I'm from Pennsylvania, but again, it varies from state to state. In Pennsylvania, it costs $700 just to change your name, and that's without needing to pay for any of the other legal proceedings you might need. And certain states do have certain different criterias if you want to change your name for certain reasons. And there's a lot of money that needs to go into it. Even like the idea of passing is classist.
Yeah.
Because you need so much money in the American healthcare system, at least, to be able to have the money to have hormones, have the money to get sexual reassignment surgery, if that's even what you want. A lot of people a lot of cis hetero people, and even some people who aren't hetero but are still cis, I have heard, feel like you have to get sexual reassignment surgery if you're trans, but
Yeah, I
you
don't.
definitely don't.
I don't think that you do, honestly. Like,
Yeah.
I'm cisgender, and I don't really think it's necessary. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think it is at all. It's really expensive, and if it's going to be that expensive, don't do it if you don't have the money.
Yeah. And there's also some people just don't personally want it.
Exactly.
know?
It's just like an inner feeling. If you know that who you are is who you are, you don't need to change it for anyone else. You would just change
Yeah.
it for yourself.
Exactly. I mean, and of course, there's other reasons some people can't do it. Some people can't do it for medical reasons. They might have a certain health condition that can put them at risk if they do. If they were to go under that surgery, some people can't even take hormones because of their specific.
Yeah.
Like if you have a certain type of heart condition, or if you have a family that has a gene that's predisposed to getting heart attacks, then your doctor is way less likely to want to give you certain types of medicine and hormones in general. Like my family, I had that problem. I don't have any heart conditions. I have like slightly higher than average blood pressure, but like that's really not that much of a problem. But because my family has a predisposition to heart conditions, my doctor was like, I can't give you any medicine, anything having to do with transitioning until you lose 80 pounds.
I have had friends who had the same issue, actually, I think.
Yeah, which is absolutely insane. But then it wasn't just you have to lose 80 pounds, because a lot of doctors in this situation will require you to get your reproductive cells stored.
Yeah.
Like, what I mean by that is like your sperm,
Mm-hmm.
if you are a male-bodied individual, or your eggs if you're a female-bodied individual. Despite the fact that studies have shown that on average their frozen samples in their current sort of state of our scientific ability are only on average viable for up to 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You have to pay out of pocket almost $800, where I was. Originally it was $1,200, but the hospital I did it at offered an out of pocket discount.
Mm-hmm.
So if your insurance company didn't help with it was considered a procedure. If they didn't help with the procedure or cover any part of it, you received a 30% discount. So instead of having to pay $1,200, I have to pay $800. And then I got a refund from my bank because I had to do, not my bank, my insurance, because I did blood work as part of it, and they were like, oh, we'll refund you for the blood work. But there's not only that, but there's the fact that you have to pay then each month.
Yeah.
Not each month, each year.
Yeah, each year.
It would be worse if it was each month.
That would be awful.
You have to pay each year a certain amount of money. And that discount is also applied to that amount of money. For me personally, for instance, I was told when I first got it that it would cost $600 a year for me to store my stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that's fine. I can do that. That's, a huge amount of money, but over the course of a year, I can definitely earn that amount of money and save it away. So then I get a call saying, hey, so your bill is $700. And I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, so because of this, that, the other thing, how we refinance every year, the cost for storage is $700. And I was like, okay, can I get a discount on that? And they were like, I don't know, let me call you like tomorrow. And so I spent a good like 24 hours panicking on how I was going to get another $100 to be able to pay for this. And then they were like, oh no, you can, like, the discount applies, you only have to pay like $450, which again is an exorbitant amount of money.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's not necessarily worth the amount of money, But I am saying that, like, for the average person, like, I'm only able to even conceive of being able to store that each year and being able to pay for that each year because as a college student, I am able to get, like, certain benefits that allow me to save money. Like, for instance, we get some meals here. You get, like, meal credit, sort of.
Yeah, kind of.
And that has helped a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also, like, there's so much.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, especially with how jobs are, too. I mean, I've had 3 jobs since I've come out. 4 jobs. Well, I got fired from Denny's.
Yeah.
And then the same day I got hired at Burger King because my brother was working at Burger King, and the manager liked him and liked anybody who he brought in, pretty much. Which was weird. And then I went to my old college and I worked as a janitor, and then I worked in Res Life, and then I worked in a coffee shop here in Prescott for 2 weeks. But the thing is, though, I personally, because of the different situations I've been in, I've not had to deal with any transphobic individuals or any individuals who have made it harder for me to be who I am.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of other people have to deal with that every day. I mean, so there was another topic I want to talk about, which is currently in the Supreme Court. I think it was 2 weeks ago, they heard a case, or started hearing the case for essentially LGBT rights. So essentially there was they're hearing 3 cases, 2 cases of gay men who were fired for coming out, and of course, being gay, and 1 woman who was fired for coming out as trans. Now, a lot of people don't know this, and when I say that they don't know this, I mean I actually did talk to a lot of people, and they were surprised to hear that still to this day,
discrimination is legal.
Discrimination against the LGBT community is legal, but it's interesting because of how it's legal.
I did know about that because of Arizona everything is legal here. To get fired, you can be not offered a house, something like that.
Yeah, so there's lots of different discrimination, and it can go and there's so many levels of it too.
Yeah. Like,
for instance, you can get fired from your job for being LGBT. You can be denied a house. You can get kicked out of your house. You can lose any aid, or you can lose your insurance at any real point if they just decide to not want to provide you with insurance. Your own kid can get kicked out of college or school just because you're gay. Yeah. Not even if they're a member of the community. If you're a member of the community, they can kick out your kid.
Or you can also be kicked out for being that too as well.
Yeah. And this is in a lot of different states. And there's just so... It's ironic. Well, what the fuck just happened with my mouth? It's ironic because I feel like it's a similar sort of thing with Obama. I know it's going to sound weird, but like when Obama was elected president, there were a group of people who were like, that's it, racism is over. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they thought, like, just because we had gotten to the point where we elected a black man as president, that racism doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, we did it, guys. It's done.
Yeah, we did it, Reddit. But of course, we know that's not true, especially with the increase in police violence, especially against individuals of color
Yeah.
in the past few years. I don't know if you heard about there was a case of a former police officer, not even a police officer, but a former police officer getting distracted when she was going home in her apartment building, walking into the wrong apartment and shooting the guy who lived in that apartment.
I did hear about that, yeah.
Because she thought it was her apartment. Meanwhile, this guy was on the couch eating ice cream. He was doing jack shit. And I heard that they attempted to use the castle defense, which in Texas essentially is a defense saying that if you're in your own home, you have the right to do whatever is necessary to defend your home, despite the fact that she was not in her home. That was in Texas. And that's where it happened. But similar to that, when people, or similar to the whole Obama thing, people thought that when gay marriage became legal, that
we're able to
that
do
was
everything.
that was the epitome of gay rights in America, at least.
It wasn't.
And obviously it's not. I mean, you still have people being fired for being gay or trans or whatever. And then you still have trans people, and especially trans people of color, facing so much violence in their lives.
Yeah.
I remember there was this huge thing. I can't remember what it was. It was in D.C., and it was this huge thing about someone was talking about trans rights and all that kind of stuff. And then it was like I think it was supposed to be like a sort of talk, you know? And what happened was these TERFs came in and started like essentially trying to crash this very civil discussion about, you know, trans community, trans rights, all that kind of stuff. And then I think it was not even a couple hours after that, not even a couple, I think it was like 10 blocks away, a trans woman was shot.
Oh.
So it was like one of those things where it's just so jarring, the differences of how it's viewed and how it's talked about, especially in America, because it goes back to like that view of we all want everybody to be equal, but there's so much moral exclusion.
Yeah.
Have you heard that term?
Moral exclusion?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have heard that word.
Well, for anybody who doesn't know, moral exclusion essentially is when it's more so used to refer to people of high morals. Let's circle back to them Christians, because Lord knows they love us. Moral exclusion essentially is like how Christianity uses or Christians rather use their religion to discriminate against people.
Yeah.
For instance, a lot of times when you hear about like the whole cake thing that happened years ago, with how there was a bakery that refused to do cakes for a gay couple.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah. The owner of the bakery was like, I am Christian, I don't believe in gay marriage or whatever. And that's an example of moral exclusion. Or how you see a lot of these more conservative individuals who are like, yeah, America, we're great. You know, we make this country strong. Everybody in this country is great, except for all of those immigrants, you know?
Yeah.
It's it's interesting. I mean, there was also talking about that in another class of how that sort of othering affects women as well.
Yeah.
And how it's because I find one of the most interesting parts about Christianity is how Christianity has been used to justify racism.
It has. It's been used for that. It's been used for homophobia.
Yeah. But the irony of Christianity being used, and Catholicism, and really just any Abrahamic religion that's primarily white people, that has been used to justify like racism or sexism or anything like that. Specifically racism, though, like there's no white people in the Bible.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of.
It's all brown people. Like,
literally, Jesus is not
yeah,
white. So
Jesus is like very. I think years ago they took like, what was that shroud that was supposed to be the shroud that was laid over Jesus when he was dead?
oh, I have no idea. Was raised atheist, so I
Yeah,
don't know.
well, I was raised for a decent portion of my childhood to be a more like Christian Catholic sort of idea. Personally, I don't subscribe to any sort of religion, but God, I forget what I was talking about.
God, mostly. Jesus
Oh,
Christ.
yeah, no. So what happened was they took the shroud that was laid over Jesus' body, and because it's supposed to have Jesus on it. Like, if you look at it, it has like his face essentially like imprinted on it, and they used that to reconstruct what his face would have looked like in 3D modeling and stuff. And I remember, I think it was the Daily Show. It was Trevor Noah said that Jesus looks like somebody that a Christian wouldn't let into the country.
Definitely, yeah, no.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a lot of moral exclusion that happens, especially with trans people, and it's a lot of history stuff. That's sort of ironic because I don't want to like try to compare sort of struggles or like equate struggles. But it is somewhat similar. I'm not going to say it's completely similar, but it does share some characteristics with a lot of stuff that happened before the big civil rights dispute with people of color, and like how there was that sort of moral exclusion between people of color and white people, and how they were treated so differently, and there was a lot of like lacks of respect in general, and that goes with trans people being dead named, and like even like the different slurs and stuff. And I think it's interesting because there's not really a lot of slurs for trans people that all trans people really feel affected by. Like I've heard people say tranny, but
yeah, that's probably like one of the worst.
But that's one of the bigger ones. But I find it interesting because I've talked to older trans people and they use that word because they feel like that's their word. They sort of
that's pretty interesting.
Have a reclamation of that word.
I use the word faggot, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a bad word technically, but like.
But you're gay.
But yeah, exactly. I use the word. Like, whenever someone would call me in high school, I'd be like, yeah, I know. Like, thanks for pointing out the obvious.
Yeah. I think it's funny because, you get people calling you those sort of names. Like, I think it is interesting because there's not really a lot of words. There's a lot of recycling, I guess you could say, when it comes to words for trans people.
Yeah.
Like faggot a lot of time is used as a derogatory term towards trans women.
All LGBT
people, really.
Mostly.
And it's weird because there's no actual meaning behind the word other than cigarette.
Yeah, it's a cigarette drag. Or
yeah.
something like that.
It's funny because
you're calling me a drag of a cigarette. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, cool, I guess. Whatever. Or like,
I don't smoke, but thanks.
dyke is just another term for a dam.
Yeah. I mean, dyke to me isn't really like a bad word. I feel like it like formed into like a description of a lesbian.
I was sort of a subset, I'd say. But like, I don't know, a lot of people I've heard use the word when referring to trans people as like transvestite.
Yeah, I was going to say
transsexual, which are very much, it's one of those things where it's not necessarily completely offensive. It's more so like it's outdated.
Yeah.
It's an outdated explanation of a individual. Which is sort of funny because I've read older texts that speak about trans individuals, and the oldest term I could find is hermaphrodite,
Oh,
which is an
yeah.
interesting idea
It's
because
a
even
long.
conceptually, it's a mix of a hermaphrodite is, I believe it was supposed to be, goes back to Greek roots. It was the child of Hermes and Aphrodite,
Mm.
and it was supposed to have characteristics, or I say it. That's a terrible thing to say. I guess that is one of the things that um, is widely considered to be derogatory, is using it instead
Yeah.
of proper
Actually,
pronouns.
I know someone who uses the pronouns it, and I don't like using them
Yeah,
for the person.
I felt that, yeah, it is definitely something that's a bit more demeaning.
Yeah.
But the idea of hermaphrodite, I feel like, is a bit odd to call someone that,
Mm-hmm.
because one, it's offensive from like an old timey sort of standpoint, because it feels like such an outdated word
Yeah.
that it feels like there's a lot more heft behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know it sounds weird, but like when you call somebody like a more old timed like word, like I called someone a clod the other day, and they
Yeah.
didn't, and they looked at me like they were like
What?
disappointed.
Yeah. Like what? Why? You know?
Yeah, like, what? You resurrected a word that has been dead for hundreds of years just to insult me.
Yeah.
Why? Oh, excuse me. Jeez. I really should be drinking more water. But yeah, it's sort of odd because of how prominent that word was, especially in early literature referring to trans people. I'm sorry that we just sort of like got onto the topic of trans people. Um,
No, it's fine.
when originally that wasn't what we were supposed to talk about, but I do think it's something that.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because I
Yeah.
feel like trans people don't have as much slurs for some reason.
Yeah, and I think I'm not saying that's something that like
It's bad.
yeah is bad necessarily. I'm not saying like we need more slurs. Like no, obviously not.
But it's
I'm
like you guys are taken away from like the other
Yeah, I
community
feel
and
like it's
stuff.
a sort of irony in a sense because we are so much othered
Uh-huh.
that.
But you're not even part of like the slurs.
Yeah,
part
and I'm
of
not
the
saying that I
LGBT
want to be.
community.
Obviously, nobody wants to be demeaned and called slurs,
Yeah.
but I think it's one of those things where instead of having like an objective word that everybody considers to be terrible and offensive, there's smaller bits, like for instance referring to somebody as it,
Yeah. Yeah, that would be one.
or dead naming somebody,
Yeah. I think that's like the slurs of the trans community, I feel like, would be those.
Yeah, it's more so like the smaller uh I guess you could say microaggressions.
Yeah.
I know
Kind
that
of.
sounds like, I know it's a word that a lot of people hear and sort of cringe over, but it's definitely a word that a lot of people need to consider, you know?
Yeah.
Because it's something that, I used to not really consider until I actually really started taking a look at how people talk about other people.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of that, there's a lot of people, and a lot of times it's not intentional when it comes to like general microaggressions and stuff, but like it's always the small things,
Mm-hmm.
and I find that to be interesting. I don't know, I always think it's funny talking to older individuals about the community, or like when they ask questions, because I do like to answer people's questions. I do like to inform friends, family, all that kind of stuff. But have you ever gotten any weird questions?
I mean, yeah, I've gotten really weird questions from people because when I came out as bisexual,
Mhm.
bisexual. I'm lesbian now,
Yeah.
but I think that's what I came out as just because it was more simple to say, and
Mhm.
a lot of the boys that I was friends with were like, "Oh my god, now we can have a threesome." Like that's a weird, like gross, just
Yeah.
disgusting
I
thing
think
to say
it's
to me.
yeah, that's one of those things that's always interesting is like I've noticed different thoughts like here. Thoughts like here. What am I talking about? Thoughts like that. Like, for instance, when it comes to like trans people are so incredibly sexualized,
Yeah.
but it's not always like as overt as that. It's more so like it's subtle usage of words, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's usage of words that in other contexts might not mean what it means in this context, right? Which obviously words change the way you say them, how you say them. That's obviously, true. But for instance, like if someone were to be like, ooh, that looks exotic, that might seem a bit off, but it's not something that a normal individual, well, I say normal individual, but like a cishet individual, cishet is short for cis hetero. Most people just pronounce cishet,
Mm-hmm.
or some people say cishet, but I say cishet because it's faster.
Fancier,
Anywho, yeah. But then if you are in a relationship with a trans person and you say you're so exotic, that seems
A little weird.
Yeah, that seems
Sexualized.
Yeah, or a lot of the gay community is considered by a lot of cishet individuals to be like hypersexual.
Yeah, I feel like we're really sexualized.
Yeah, and which is ironic, right? Because it's not like our sex is hurting anybody.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's not like by us like boning in our own house behind our own closed and locked doors is going to affect Cheryl, who lives next door, who definitely can't hear us because she's watching Family Feud for like the 278th
Also, she can't hear
night in a row.
anyways, so
Yeah.
Cheryl.
She just loves Steve Harvey. I mean, who doesn't love Steve Harvey? He's got that
He's
Mr.
Steve Harvey.
Potato Head thing going on.
Yeah, he's Steve Harvey.
I'm sorry. I know that sounds weird, but if you look at a side by side of Mr. Potato Head and Steve
definitely
Harvey,
looks like Mr. Potato Head. I definitely can see that. If Mr. Potato Head had a body, it would be Steve Harvey. Especially his mustache just
right?
completes
It's like that
the look.
thick mustache. You ever
With
see a
no
picture
hair.
You ever see the picture of Steve Harvey without his eyebrows or his mustache?
I really don't want to see that image, so.
But yeah, God, we got so off topic. But
Steve
yeah,
Harvey.
it's and we've been talking about that in other classes I've been taking, which I find interesting of how much we're talking about that, because I really enjoy having those open discussions and hearing what other people think about it. But I mean, I've certainly met other individuals of the community who are very sexual and who are, and obviously have sex a lot. One of them. No, it's just who I am, and that's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you like to have sex, then of course have sex. Just be safe about it and everything. As long as like it's a consenting individual, then there shouldn't really be a problem.
Of age, obviously.
Yes, of age. Well, you have to be of age to legally consent.
Exactly.
You also have to be not under the influence of any substances.
Yes.
I told someone that the other day, and they looked at me like I just handed them the holy fucking grail. Like they didn't know that.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
They can't be blackout drunk?
Yeah, well, so if you essentially are what is considered legally drunk, like if you were to blow into a breathalyzer and you would be drunk, or even if you're just even remotely under the influence, like even if you've had like 2 or 3 drinks, that's still considered to be under the influence. You cannot legally consent to having sex, no matter what the situation is. Even if you're like in a relationship with this person, or whatever the situation is, you cannot consent to having sex.
Yeah.
Which I find to be interesting because of the fact of how little people know that. Because that goes into a lot of like victimization and how people want other people to feel bad for what they did, but that's not on the topic. We're talking about gay people right now.
Yeah.
We're talking
gay
about
people.
the gays. But yeah, I think it's also interesting because of how much more visible trans people and gay people in general have been. I mean, like, I watch a lot. I'm very much in tune with a lot of superhero stuff, sci-fi stuff.
Yeah.
And there's a huge amount of characters now who are, on that sexual gender spectrum and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's very much inferred. Like well, not inferred, but there's a shapeshifter character on one of the shows that I watch, and they are referred to as they.
Mm.
And they're more like non-binary, and it's sort of funny because they're played by an actress who in other seasons has played a cis hetero woman, but again, because that new character is a shapeshifter, it's all funky like that.
Yeah.
But anywho, but yeah, same creative team also has another character on another show who is a trans woman who's played by a trans woman, and that's like fantastic. First off,
That's great. Yeah.
yeah, but second off, they don't treat it like it's weird or that it's like new or different because of, I think it's partially because of the narrative, because I will say the show, it's Supergirl. A lot of people I hear don't like Supergirl just because they can't take and these are mostly men, they can't take the fact that Supergirl is canonically stronger than Superman, and so they have to piss and shit their little shorts. But that is something I do want to actually point that out. Canonically speaking, Supergirl is stronger than Superman. That's because she spent more time on Krypton, and as such, her physiology is developed to that point. Sorry, you don't really care about that. But having this character who's played by Nicole Maines, who is also a very well-known trans activist, having her be there and having her giving like this really strong performance that is a lot more realistic than I anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
It's really sort of beautiful in a sense.
Yeah.
Like, there was a lot of aspects of it that I found interesting because, as a new character on a superhero show, obviously she has powers. And it's interesting how they treat her powers in the show because it is sort of different from the comics, because in the show they mention that her powers come from, it's like a linear thing, a lineage rather. Every firstborn woman in the line of her family gets these powers.
Interesting.
But since she's trans, they didn't think it would be her, and then when she got the powers, it caused like a rift between her and her sister, who had been training for them for years and who wanted them so badly. But like seeing like that familial fighting sort of reminded me of how it was when I first came out, because there was that part where there's a part in the show where her sister, out of like pure like anger and just frustration, says like, "Why did you even get these? You're not a real woman."
Yeah.
And like that's a lot of what people will try to say about trans people, is that we're not, or real. Trans women specifically, is that we're not like real women, despite the fact that scientifically speaking our brains are more similar to somebody who is cis hetero, a female who is cis hetero. Our brains are actually more similar, and vice versa for trans men.
Yeah, I've seen those actually.
Yeah, which is ironic because then people will be like, facts don't care about your feelings. And I'm like, well, do facts care about science? But anywho, yeah, or for instance, recently, like 3 weeks ago, Batwoman premiered, which is a TV show about, it's the cousin of Bruce Wayne, but she's gay.
Yeah.
She's a lesbian. And she's played by a famous lesbian.
Ruby Rose?
Yeah, Ruby Rose.
Love her.
Yeah.
Love her.
And she's really great. And it's really interesting because this isn't the first time that, again, these people who have made this show have had gay characters in 2 other shows. They've had bisexual and gay characters. And they don't treat it like it's a weird thing. They're just like, hey, that happened. Let's move on.
Yeah.
We're fighting Nazis now. Like,
Yeah. There's actually a show that my brother watches called The Loud House
oh yeah, I've
on
heard of that one.
Nickelodeon, I think.
It is on Nickelodeon,
Yeah,
yes.
and they have the best friend of the main characters has two dads, and then also
Mhm.
the main character has a sister who's gay in the show, and it's like really cool to see
Yeah.
that like kids are watching this show and they just like think it's normal. Like my brother didn't think anything of it.
Yeah, like
Like I was like, "Do you see his dads?" And he was like, "Yeah, what about the dads?" I was like, "Do you see the
they're
dads?"
cool dads. They made apple slices.
They're dads.
But yeah, I think another one of those shows that also contributed to that is or the rise in that, I would say, is Steven Universe.
Yeah.
I mean,
I did hear about that.
technically speaking, all of the gems in that show don't have a gender.
Yeah.
They've talked about that multiple times in the show, how they don't, like, I think it's part of like a cultural thing. They just don't have gender, so they just present how they want.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting thing, but it's also the fact of how they treat different relationships in that show. I mean, like, I didn't think that I would see a kid's show that legitimately talked about abusive relationships.
Yeah.
And then Steven Universe was like, let's devote an entire storyline to an abusive relationship. Or like all this other stuff. Like, they talk so much about like exploring your identity and who you are, or like for instance, they do a fusion thing in Steven Universe, like the gems can fuse together. And I haven't watched a lot of the show, but I know there are a couple parts in the show where Steven fuses with his girlfriend,
Interesting.
whose name is Connie.
Mm-hmm.
And which is kind of weird because fusion is sort of supposed to sort of represent sex in a sort of way.
Ah.
But they when they are fused together have their own sort of identity, and it's interesting because they are intersex, which is not something I thought a kid's show would talk about either. Yeah. For anyone who's listening who doesn't know, someone who's born intersex is born with with essentially both reproductive systems in their body.
Yeah.
Both male and female reproductive systems and organs. And they're more likely to, well, basically, there's like a whole thing with that of how historically and even now, individuals who are born intersex are more likely to have a high amount of gender dysphoria, but also have their genitals reconstructed as children.
Yeah, as
like
babies.
As babies. Not even
newborns.
Not even like a couple months or years old. Like when they're like weeks old, they will perform surgery on this baby.
Yeah.
Which is really fucked up. But then, people don't care about that. But then when a trans kid is like, I'm trans, I want to transition, they're like, you're mutilating our children.
That's so true. I've never even thought of that point before.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it's interesting, that point too, because of how a lot of people want to view trans people.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that this has devolved into, or not really devolved, but gone into a talk about LGBT stuff, because we originally had started out talking about more broad stuff, but I really think that this is a very interesting conversation. And I definitely think that this is something a lot of people need to hear, a lot of people need to know. But yeah, I remember reading an article that was written by an individual who's, I want to say they're a bit more confused. They're not entirely sure about the entire situation, but the way they were talking about, so essentially the article was about how Ruby Rose at one point in their life identified as a man. And I'm like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
That doesn't really have anything to do with me, or that's just like a cool little trivia thing you could put on.
Yeah.
I don't know, whatever. I mean, they seem more gender neutral the way they dress anyway, so it's not really a huge
I
deal.
think that they came out as gender neutral a little bit ago, if I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken.
But then this person used this one person to attempt to sort of like disenfranchise and completely completely invalidate an entire group of people, like to essentially say that all trans people have experienced such horrible trauma in their life that they need or they feel the need to transition, which is like one really fucked up. But they also use themselves to say that. And I've talked to a lot of people who have experienced childhood trauma, and they say that they've had similar sort of feelings. But the thing is, though, that I think when you have that childhood trauma linked to that idea, I think it becomes you're linking to the idea of what you think trans is, which is identifying out of your current situation.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people obviously don't understand what trans is from that point of view.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought it was interesting because, I think it was a viewpoint that on one hand is valid. There are people who maybe start to transition but realized, I still feel this way, but I'm more comfortable with who I am physically, And, a lot of people will seem to attempt to try to use that kind of stuff to say that trans people are invalid for whatever reason. But really, I think it's just oh, this is against like the liberal idea because blah, 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 blah. When in reality, the liberal idea is just being able to freely explore who you want to be and like who you are.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, a fantastic thing to do. Being able to freely explore yourself and who you want to be is like, it's so incredible and freeing. And yet you have that sort of idea that like that's not what you should do. I think that's interesting. Okay, so we're going to take a very short break, and when we come back, we're going to, just wrap up a little bit. And we are back. Okay, sorry for the sort of a long extension of that topic, but, I think all of us got a little bit of something out of that. So, I would like to thank everybody for tuning in to the first episode. I will be doing this every week, so keep an eye out next week. Next week, if you're lucky, and looking at the wheel, there's a lot of lucky spots on there. I think you'll be able to get 2 episodes next week. First one's going to be releasing on Tuesday, and that's going to be a special Halloween episode. And then the second one's going to be a bit more standard, Thank everybody. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, for listening in, or, well, you can't really watch because, it's a blank screen right now, but, maybe we'll do some video in the future. You never know. But thank everybody for tuning in, and I will catch all of you guys next time. This has been Disassembly Required, signing off.